Kimmswick, a small compact community about 4 blocks by 4 blocks, celebrated its centennial a few decades ago and is still a living town. There is no pictorial documentation available of the earliest years, but there is a wealth of pictures after 1900. At the east end of town, the railroad station was a focal point in the community, as this busy scene would indicate. The railroad and the town were truly entwined, with the cars on a siding behind the station, cars that had minimum living accommodations for section men. The automobile made slow progress in the beginning, and the novelty that it was captured the photographer's fancy. Horse-drawn vehicles were still the reliable way to get around town. In times of heavy snow, wheeled vehicles gave way to sleighs. Nowadays, groups of visitors arrive in air-conditioned buses. There have always been commercial operations in Kimmswick, such as the Meyer store, the Rauschenbach Harness Shop and Store, the Barber Shop, and the Ziegler Store. Today, there are many shops, mostly in restored buildings, the 4 just mentioned, the Meyer store, the Rauschenbach building, the Barber Shop, the Ziegler store, and also the Little Ziegler House, the Arnold House, the Witte building, the market, and many others. An interior view of the market shows how it looked when the Weck family owned it. After the building was put back in shape, the old herringbone brick walk was leveled and raised, along with the cut stone curbing. Woodman Hall was a popular rallying place in the old days for lodge meetings, dances, and band performances. In the spring of 1986, the Kimmswick Historical Society took possession of a former church on the north end of town, providing greater seating capacity than anything since Woodman Hall. The old brick schoolhouse is gone, razed in the 1940s. St. Joseph's was the center of a large active parish, which celebrated its 75th anniversary in 1980. A larger church and school was built in 1998 west of Interstate 55 on Old Antonia Road. But let's go back to the beginning. A native of Brunswick, Germany, Theodore Kimm immigrated to St. Louis in 1835. There, he established himself as a dry goods merchant, but 15 years later, in 1850, he moved south to Jefferson County, where he purchased a large tract of land. Did he leave St. Louis because of the devastating fire of 1849, which started on the riverfront with the steamer White Cloud and destroyed 23 moored boats and most of the St. Louis business district? This map shows the burned blocks in black. Or was it the cholera epidemic the same year, the deaths from which are recorded here in a newspaper? He had a wife and young son whose health might have been his concern. Perhaps he wasn't fleeing from what he felt was an undesirable location, but rather he sought something more. The railroad, the Iron Mountain branch of the Missouri Pacific, was on its way to be completed in Pilot Knob by 1857. Whatever boats had not burned were still making frequent stops along the Mississippi. Kimmswick was to become one of them. Mr. Kimm built his own house, a 3-story mansard roof brick building between the railroad and the river. In 1858, he established a post office, and the next year, 1859, he officially founded the town, naming it after himself. He laid out the town in the grid system, which was the St. Louis pattern. The streets bore many of the same names, Elm, Market, and Front Streets, either in imitation of St. Louis or merely using the conventional small-town nomenclature. An auction of town lots took place in 1867. The railroad advertised it and offered excursion rates. The early progress of the town was undoubtedly slowed by the Civil War. the Franz Hermann House was said to have been occupied by Union soldiers. The town roster included several stores, a dry goods, a brickyard, a marble works, and a flour mill. One of the earliest names associated with development was that of Gustav Rauschenbach. In 1869, Gustav Rauschenbach, a German stonemason, built a 3-story brick building, the National Hotel, which was a popular stopping place for travelers by rail or by river until the automobile took over transportation. The hotel was torn down in 1921. Miraculously, the call bells of the hotel survived. Eldon Rauschenbach, grandson of Gustav, died in January 1978 at the age of 88. He lived all but the first 2 years of his life in the house built by his uncle Otto as a store and dwelling in 1884. Here is the building as it looked originally. When Eldon, who served in the army during the First World War, returned from the war, he had the building remodeled in the front, doing away with the store. At the time of Eldon's death, the building looked like this. The Ziegler family has been in Kimmswick since 1861. Captain Ziegler purchased a house on Market Street. When the house burned, the family built a new house in 1879 on an adjoining lot owned by Michael Ziegler, son of Captain Ziegler. Some member of that family occupied that house until the 1950s. Mike Jr. carried on his father's watch repair and jewelry business. Here, Mike Jr. is seen at the wheel of the new delivery truck with his father on the right and his brothers in the rear. Mike Jr. lived the last part of his life in Windsor Harbor, just south of Kimmswick. A year after the town incorporated, 1871, and 22 years after he arrived in Jefferson County, Mr. Kim decided to retire. In May of 1872, another auction took place in which all unsold lots in town were offered, as well as the Kim property. Mr. Kim was 61 years old and his wife 4 years older. Their only child, Ernest Peltzer Kim, died at the age of 9 in 1853. After the property sale, the Kims went to Europe, returning to the United States for visits. Mrs. Kim died in St. Louis in 1876 and was buried in Kimmswick beside her son. Mr. Kim continued his commuting and, according to one newspaper account, made at least 29 crossings of the Atlantic. The end of the Kim story was summed up by a newspaper columnist on March 17, 1886. Theodore Kim, our old and esteemed friend and the founder of our town, died in Switzerland on the 5th of February last. Before the turn of the century, nearby Montezano Park was a popular tourist attraction, drawing St. Louisans for the day who came on boats such as the City of Providence, which had an elegant dining room. According to contemporary accounts, the shady rural setting offered a place to dance and watch entertainment, to dine or have informal picnicking, an opportunity to get one's picture taken, and drink some of the healthful water from the famous springs. Here is an ingenious cart for getting around the grounds. This area outside the northern boundary of town is now residential. Montezano Park's decay and subsequent demise were conditions shared to a degree by Kimmswick itself. The Wirtz store went out of business. Oheim's Saloon and Beer Garden was a family establishment. It had a disastrous fire and was never rebuilt. It also was the home to Uncle John's Health Water that he marketed in St. Louis. Substantial brick buildings were torn down, such as this small attractive house next to the Meyer store, which had ceased to function as a mercantile establishment. The Girard Mill went out of business and its companion lumber yard moved to Imperial. Here is the Girard House before its restoration. The bank was in operation for some 20-odd years. After closing, the building suffered the fate of many empty structures. It was vandalized, as shown here in a 1960 picture, and was then torn down. After local trains were discontinued, the station operated as a freight depot for a few years and was then razed. A success story, by contrast, is that of the post office. Since 1858, it has served the community in various locations. Here is a scene taken shortly after the building was built in 1913. The post office was returned to this building in 1974. This is the cancellation mark still in use today, produced by a hand-operated machine. The Wenham Drake House looked like this in 1960, before the last white oak on the lawn died. And here it is today, now privately owned. The steps in the front were salvaged from the National Hotel. The Royce Terry House, built in 1866, has remained virtually unchanged. Apparently in the beginning it was a 2-story brick with a frame addition at the back put on a little later. Renovation was concentrated in the interior, with only a picket fence needed to set off the outward appearance. The building on the left is the Yellow House, built in 1872 by Jacob Fink. It seems it was always rental property. The Wagner family owned the adjoining house on the right. This, as well as other buildings in town, has an interior brick construction. Handmade bricks were carefully laid between timber supports with plaster on the interior and wood siding on the exterior. The second floor of the house was not plastered, and the brick construction was plainly visible. On the right is the extensively restored Wagner House. Wagner had his wagon and blacksmith shop behind his house. On Mill Street at 2nd Street is a restaurant known as the Blue Owl Restaurant and Bakery, which has been serving lunch since the June Festival of 1981. The building was once Green's Tavern until 1978, when the Tierney family lived there. Before the 1-story addition, Edna Tierney and her neighbor, Seal Redmond, made apple butter in the side yard. The Boggs house dates back to 1866. Mr. Boggs raised squabs for hotels in St. Louis, as well as show pigeons. Out front remains the old hand-crank cistern pump. The Mall House, 1872, has undergone many alterations over the years. The construction of the Franz Hermann House, built by Gottlieb Meyer in 1859, was delayed by the Civil War. The rear yard sits over a stone vaulted cellar used as a winery and storage cellar. The bakery, built in 1880, over the years has been a residence, cobbler shop, specialty shoe store, general store, print shop, and bakery. It was known for its pumpernickel bread. The Black Schoolhouse was established in 1883. It was a town library in the 1940s. Now it is part of a residence on Oak Street. Dr. Kirk built the Kirk House in 1888 for his bride. The room to the left was his office. The Doherty House was built by Gustav Rauschenbach in 1896. His daughter Lena Rauschenbach Doherty inherited the house. Even a cursory look around this modern community must acknowledge the presence and use of log buildings which are not indigenous to the site and actually predate the Kimmswick structures. The Burgess Howe building was the first log house moved to Kimmswick. It is simply furnished. It was a farmhouse on the Howe property located on Highway Z between Peevely and Hillsborough. The Howe family lived there from 1895 until Miss Ada Howe sold the property in 1970. Ed Kottmeyer, the purchaser, gave the house to the Kimmswick Restoration Project. When the siding came off the logs were numbered and moved to Kimmswick in 1972, and the building, in its simple original form, 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, was put back up in 1973. The Barbagallo House originally stood in St. Louis County on Green Park Road and was clearly visible from Interstate 55. The Santo Barbagallo family lived in it from 1920 until shortly before it was moved in 1975. Nestled into a hillside, it had a porch on one side and an enclosed porch on the other. This is the process of putting it back up. The search for numbers, then upward from the rock first floor, topped by rafters, dormers and roof, windows, and finally it is finished with 2 porches as they were originally. The last major log building to be completed is the Old House, the biggest and most historic. It stood on Highway 6167 in the part of Arnold that was originally called Beck. The first 2 rooms, log pens with a dog trot between, are said to date back to Revolutionary times. Eventually, the front and sides were weatherboarded, but the logs remained visible in the back. It was used throughout the years as an overnight stop for travelers and later as a tavern. Mrs. Amanda Obermiller owned it during the 30s and 40s and operated it as an antique shop and tea room. Here is Mrs. Obermiller's mother, Mrs. Gustav Meissner, sitting in the back room by the fireplace. The old house was disassembled in 2 weeks in the spring of 1973 to make way for a doctor's building now standing on the original site. The Kimmswick reconstruction phase of the old house stretched out over a period of 5 years, interrupted by necessary work on other structures. The rock foundation was done in the autumn of 1973. It wasn't until 3 years later, after the Barbagallo house was completed, that the superstructure was tackled. Note the crane that hoists the logs into position, used for all the reconstruction of log buildings in Kimmswick. Here it is leveling a log. And here is the old house nearing completion, and the old house completed as viewed from the front. At the left is a 1-story log room constructed from materials salvaged from other buildings to add to the floor space. The old house now houses a restaurant. The first luncheon was held during the Kimmswick Summer Festival of 1978 with Senator John Danforth as the honored guest. There are other log structures. The winery moved from the Helen Barbagallo farm, which was on Lion's Den Road. It was a temporary home of Jacob Blank and his wife while building a larger log home. The winery was furnished with this large press. The cabin, built in 1876 in Mappaville, was moved twice. First from its original site to the old house in Beck for use as an outbuilding, then to Kimmswick for preservation. Here it is under construction in Kimmswick, and here it is today, finished. The blacksmith shop of 1847 was the last log structure to be moved to Kimmswick. It was moved from a farm on Butler Hill Road in St. Louis. The restoring of houses and rebuilding of log structures, begun in 1970, were under the supervision of Allen Bristol, lifelong resident of the area, until his retirement in 1982. His grandfather was Captain George Waters, an early Jefferson County landowner. The City Hall was built in 1903. Note the 2 small windows to the rear of the building. These were used to house prisoners in the jail section of the City Hall. This sketch of the City Hall was made by local artist Hazel Lee, whose death in 1981 was mourned by many. She was the proprietor of the first restored store in Kimmswick, president of the Kimmswick Historical Society, and an enthusiastic booster of Kimmswick. She bicycled in and around Kimmswick frequently. A community such as Kimmswick, in taking inventory, must look to its children for future strength. The archives provide a charming picture of 5-year-old Lowell Oheim, grandson of the first Oheim. Here he is with his tricycle and his dog at the back of the family home on Market Street. Here is Mr. Oheim on his last visit to Kimmswick before his death. He is standing by the plugged well from which his grandfather drew health water, which he marketed in St. Louis. A glance around modern Kimmswick is reassuring as to future citizenry. Almost on any fair day, young children can be seen with their bikes or trikes on the streets. There is much to see while strolling in Kimmswick in architectural details. Fish scale shingles, brickwork, and several examples of gingerbread. At the edge of town, spanning Rock Creek, is a graceful iron bridge. 1874, the year of its construction, makes it appropriate for the town of Kimmswick. Although in the modern world of concrete bridges, it certainly seems an anachronism. However, its future appears assured now that it has been awarded a place on the National Register. The old bridge is now restricted to pedestrians and bicycles, and a new concrete span nearby provides passage for motorized vehicles. On your way out of town, notice the red granite marker on Highway K. This boulder marks the El Camino Real Trail, the oldest road in Missouri. We hope you've enjoyed your visit to Kimmswick and will come back and visit us again.